A millionaire was tormented by a problem that no one could solve. His twin sons simply couldn't sleep. One night, coming home tired from work, he realized he couldn't find the children anywhere in the mansion. Desperate, he searched every room, but the silence only increased his anguish. Finally, he decided to check the office. When he turned the doorknob and opened the door, his eyes widened and his whole body froze at the scene. What he saw there changed everything forever. The biting November wind whipped through the canyons of New York City, but nothing compared to the coldness emanating from the wrought iron gates of the mansion. For Elisa, standing on the sidewalk with her worn-out shoulder bag, the place looked like a castle from a dark fairy tale. The lights, on in only a few windows, seemed like tired, watchful eyes observing the city that never slept. For a moment, she thought of her little David, waiting for her in the cramped apartment in Queens where they lived, and the warmth of that thought was the only thing that stopped her from turning around and running away. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the heavy gate, which groaned like a lament, and walked for the first time on the polished stones that would lead her to her new job. The massive wooden front door opened before she could ring the bell. A woman with a rigid posture and a severe, impeccable bun, who introduced herself as Adelaide, the housekeeper, led her inside without a hint of warmth in her eyes. The interior was even more overwhelming. The marble on the floor was so glossy it reflected the crystal chandelier like a frozen lake. The silence was thick, almost palpable, broken only by the echo of her own timid footsteps. Adelaide handed her the uniform and a list of tasks with a curt warning. "Mr. Sterling values silence and discretion. Do your job and you won't be noticed." Elisa just nodded, a knot tightening in her chest at the indifference of the place. As she changed, she heard it for the first time. It wasn't a noise, but a sound of pure anguish. A sharp, desperate cry that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the very walls of the immense house were weeping. It was a dual sound. Two small voices joined in a chorus of suffering that pierced Elisa's soul. A shiver ran down her spine. This wasn't the cry of a hungry baby or one with a dirty diaper. It was the sound of a pain she knew all too well. Over the next few hours, as she scrubbed floors and polished silver worth more than everything she owned, the crying was her only companion. It was a constant, torturous soundtrack. At one point, she saw the owner of the house, Richard Sterling. He was descending the stairs, phone pressed to his ear, talking about millions in tech stocks and the volatility of the market, but his face was the picture of defeat. The dark circles under his eyes and his slumped shoulders betrayed an exhausted man, a multi-millionaire whose immense fortune was useless against the sorrow consuming him. He walked past her as if she were invisible, his gaze lost in the void. Elisa felt a pang of compassion for this stranger. His wealth, his vast portfolio, couldn't buy what mattered most: peace. When night had fully fallen and her shift was about to end, the crying intensified, reaching a level of desperation that made Elisa stop, cloth in hand. The housekeeper had already retired to her quarters, and the house was surrendered to that symphony of pain. Guided by an instinct she couldn't control, she walked down the silent hallway toward the sound. The nursery door was ajar, a sliver of soft light escaping through it. She peeked inside. There, in two exquisitely carved cribs, two tiny creatures writhed, their faces red and swollen, their little hands clutching at the air. There was no nanny, no nurse, just the two babies. Alone in their agony, her mother's heart broke into 1,000 pieces. She knew she should leave, that it wasn't her place, that Adelaide's warning echoed in her mind, but her feet seemed nailed to the floor, and her hand, of its own accord, rose slowly toward the golden doorknob. Her heart pounded, a frantic drum against the oppressive silence of the mansion. Reason screamed at her to retreat, to return to the shadows she came from, but the baby's cries were a magnet, a maternal force pulling at every fiber of her being. With a tremor that ran through her entire body, Elisa turned the knob and pushed the door open gently. The room was a sanctuary of luxury, with white wooden furniture and a carpet so plush her feet sank into it, but it was a cold, impersonal luxury, like a set designed for a photograph. It lacked warmth. It lacked life. The two boys, identical in their distress, thrashed in their expensive cribs, their small lungs working overtime to expel a pain no one seemed to understand. She approached the nearest crib, where one of the twins struggled with his eyes shut tight. Instinctively, she reached out, not to touch him, but just to hover her hand over him, a gesture of silent comfort. "It's okay, little one," she whispered, her voice so low it was barely audible. "I'm here." The vibration of her voice seemed to cut through the air. The baby stopped screaming for a second, a sob escaping his lips. He opened his eyes, two bright, swollen and tear-filled blue stones, and stared at her. There was a spark of recognition in that gaze, an instant connection that defied all logic. Elisa began to hum an old lullaby, the same one her grandmother sang to her, the same one she sang to David every night. It was a simple melody, with no grand words, but heavy with the weight of tenderness and tradition. The baby's cry turned into a low whimper, and his tiny fists, once clenched in agony, began to relax. Seeing the effect, she moved to the other crib and continued the melody. The second baby also quieted, his gaze fixed on Elisa's face, as if she were the only real thing in that vast, lonely room. She didn't dare pick them up, didn't dare break the invisible barrier between employer and employee, but her presence seemed to be enough. "What do you think you're doing in here?" The voice was like the crack of a whip, cold and sharp. Elisa spun around, her heart plummeting to her stomach. Adelaide, the housekeeper, stood in the doorway, her arms crossed and her face twisted into a mask of disapproval. "Your work is finished. Your job in this house is to clean, not to play nanny. Get out, immediately." Humiliation burned Elisa's face. She felt small, inadequate, an intruder. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Adelaide. I heard the crying and—" she stammered, backing toward the door. "I don't want apologies. I want obedience," the housekeeper retorted, escorting her out and closing the nursery door with a sharp click, muffling the sound of the crying that was starting again, weaker now. Elisa rushed to the staff room, changed with trembling hands, and left the mansion without looking back, feeling Adelaide's glare burning into her back. The journey home was long and bleak. On the crowded city bus, she felt more alone than ever. The opulence of that house contrasted brutally with her reality. Mr. Sterling, with his business deals and capital spread across investments in multiple countries, had everything money could buy, but he had no peace. And she, who counted every penny to pay the rent for their small apartment, possessed the most valuable treasure in the world, her son's embrace. When she arrived, she found David sitting on the front stoop, drawing in an old notebook. He ran into her arms, and the warmth of his small body was the balm her wounded soul needed. That night, as she tucked David into bed, he asked why she was sad. "Mommy's just tired, my love," she answered, adjusting his blanket. As she emptied the pockets of her uniform to wash it, she felt something soft between her fingers. It was a tiny blue wool sock, too small to be David's. It must have fallen from the crib. Holding the small piece of fabric, a shiver ran down her spine. It was as if a piece of that sadness, of that silent call, had followed her home. The night was long and restless. Elisa tossed and turned in her narrow bed, the echo of the twins' cries and the harshness of Adelaide's voice taking turns in her thoughts. Beside her, David slept the peaceful sleep of the innocent, oblivious to the worries that haunted his mother. At dawn, while preparing weak coffee, she held the small blue sock in her hands. It was such an insignificant object, yet it seemed to weigh a ton. Returning to that house was like volunteering for more humiliation. However, the image of the overdue rent and the increasingly bare cupboards was a stronger argument than her wounded pride. Money, as much as it pained her to admit, was the force that moved her, the only guarantee that David would have a roof over his head and food on the table. Swallowing her fear, she decided she would go back. She would be invisible, a shadow. She would do her work with her head down and her heart locked away, ignoring the sounds coming from upstairs. When she arrived at the mansion, Adelaide was waiting for her in the foyer, like a sentinel guarding a fortress. Her gaze was a cold appraisal, almost surprised to see her there. Without a word of greeting, she handed her a new list of tasks. They were the heaviest, most isolated jobs in the house: cleaning the damp basement, organizing the dusty wine cellar, and scrubbing the grout between the tiles in the vast service kitchen. The message was clear: stay away, far away, from the heart of the home and its precious heirs. Elisa obeyed in silence, feeling the weight of the oppression. Even in the basement, the baby's crying was audible, a muffled, persistent sound that seeped through the concrete like the pulse of a sick heart. The day dragged on in a melancholy monotony. In the middle of the afternoon, while polishing silverware in the pantry, she saw Richard Sterling hurry past in the hallway. He was on the phone, his voice tense, mixing words about falling stock prices in Europe and the returns on an investment fund. "I don't care about the cash flow. I need a solution," he said, frustration evident in his voice. For a moment, his eyes met Elisa's. In them was a helplessness so profound, a loneliness so vast, that she forgot he was a billionaire and she was just a cleaner. She saw only a father, broken and at the end of his rope, whose immense wealth and countless assets were useless. He looked away first, disappearing into his study and shutting the door. That brief glimpse of his vulnerability touched her in an unexpected way, creating an invisible bond of compassion. Later, while waxing the floor of the grand hall, the crisis upstairs reached a new peak. The screams were sharper, more desperate. They sounded like panic. Elisa's heart clenched with every wail. She gripped the handle of the floor buffer, her knuckles white, fighting the urge to drop everything and run up there. Adelaide was on a call with a supplier, her back to Elisa, distracted for a moment. Closing her eyes, Elisa began to hum the lullaby, softly, almost in a whisper, more to calm herself than for any other reason. The simple, sweet melody floated through the air, drifting up the marble staircase like a silent prayer. In his study, Richard ran his hands through his hair, his head aching from the incessant cacophony. Suddenly, something changed. The crying didn't stop, but it faltered. The shrill screams were interrupted by a sob, then another. A fragile silence, lasting no more than 5 seconds, hung in the air. It was so sudden and unusual that Richard lifted his head, his senses on high alert. What could have caused that break in the storm? He sat motionless, waiting, his heart beating with an expectation he hadn't felt in months. The silence was gone as quickly as it came, but the seed of a question had been planted. Something different had happened, and he had no idea what it was. In the days that followed, the Sterling mansion became a silent battlefield. On one side was Adelaide, her icy authority orchestrating Elisa's tasks, deliberately confining her to the most remote corners of the house. She seemed to take a perverse pleasure in overloading her, as if physical exhaustion could erase the strange influence the cleaner had on the babies. On the other side was Elisa, carrying out her duties with quiet dignity, but with her heart on constant alert. She moved through the corridors like a shadow, the lullaby always on the tip of her tongue, a soft hum she would release into the air whenever the twins' crying reached a peak of despair, and the pattern repeated. The crying would waver. A brief pause of silence would settle, and then the wailing would resume, but less intensely. It was a subtle effect, almost imperceptible to an unattuned ear, but to a father on the edge, it was like a beacon in the fog. Richard Sterling started to notice. At first, he dismissed it as coincidence, a trick of his exhausted mind. But the pauses in the crying became more frequent, small windows of peace in his chaotic day. He tried to correlate the events. Maybe the new nanny had found a trick, or the new homeopathic remedy was starting to work. But nothing fit. One afternoon, he was in his study, trying to focus on a report about his assets and liabilities, when the screaming upstairs became unbearable. He stood up, ready to go up and try, yet again, to soothe his sons when he heard it. It was a soft, almost ethereal melody coming from downstairs. The voice was so quiet he had to hold his breath to hear it, and, like magic, the crying stopped. Not just subsided, but stopped completely for almost a full minute. Intrigued, Richard walked silently to his door and opened it a crack. In the hallway, her back to him, was Elisa, polishing a silver vase. It was her, singing. He watched, fascinated and bewildered. How could this woman, a complete stranger, achieve with a simple hum what renowned therapists, experienced nannies, and a fortune in imported toys could not? The scene was so surreal he felt like an intruder in his own home. He watched her finish polishing the vase, put away her supplies, and walk toward the exit, completely unaware she was being observed. He remained there, motionless, long after she had gone, the sound of the melody still echoing in his mind. The seed of a question had sprouted, growing into an unsettling curiosity. Meanwhile, Elisa's life outside the mansion was getting complicated. David's school principal called her in for a meeting. In a stern tone, she pointed to the attendance record. David had been arriving late almost every day. Elisa tried to explain her grueling routine, the long bus ride, and the difficulty of juggling schedules, but the principal was unmoved. "Ma'am, the rules are for everyone. If the tardiness continues, I'll be forced to take more serious measures. Perhaps this school isn't the right fit for your son." The veiled threat of expulsion landed on Elisa like a stone. Leaving the school would mean losing the only support network she had, the only place David could be a child safely while she worked. The pressure was mounting from all sides, a knot tightening in her throat. That night, as she tried to mend a tear in David's school uniform, a neighbor knocked on her door. She was a bitter woman whose face seemed permanently etched with envy. "Just came to give you a heads up," she said with a malicious smirk. "People are watching you, people who think you're not taking proper care of your boy, leaving him to run around on his own." The warning was a knife disguised as advice. Elisa closed the door, her heart cold. That small apartment, once her refuge, now felt like a cage. And the walls were closing in. The principal's threat and the neighbor's venom created cracks in Elisa's already fragile armor. Fear became her constant companion, a shadow that followed her from dawn to dusk. To avoid being late, she started waking up even earlier in the dead of night, preparing everything for David before she left. She would leave him in the care of Mrs. Lucia, a kind elderly woman who lived in the next room, promising to be back as soon as she could. The trade-off was painful. To secure her son's future, she had to sacrifice precious morning moments with him. By the time she arrived at the mansion, exhaustion already weighed on her shoulders, but she pushed it down, focusing on her work. The house, however, seemed to absorb her anguish. The twins' crying grew more persistent, sharper, as if they sensed the turmoil battering the one person who brought them any relief. Richard Sterling, for his part, had become a keen observer. His initial curiosity had turned into a silent investigation. He began to notice the correlation between Elisa's presence in certain areas of the house and his son's brief moments of calm. He saw how Adelaide kept her away, assigning her tasks that isolated her. He started to see the quiet injustice happening under his own roof. The housekeeper, who for years had been his right hand in managing his domestic estate, now seemed controlling, almost tyrannical in her management. He saw the way she spoke to Elisa with barely concealed contempt, and a discomfort began to grow within him. He, a man accustomed to analyzing balance sheets and predicting market movements, was finally learning to read between the lines of the human relationships in his own home. One morning, while Elisa was cleaning the large glass doors leading to the garden, one of the twins, Gabriel, crawled out of the playpen in the living room. The nanny on duty was distracted on her phone, and Adelaide was sorting a pile of mail at a nearby desk. No one saw him. Gabriel, drawn by the sunlight glinting on the floor, moved with surprising determination toward the open door. He reached Elisa, who was crouched outside, and with an effort pulled himself up on her legs to try to stand. He lifted his little arms toward her, a silent plea for attention. Elisa's heart leaped. She glanced inside, saw that no one was watching, and her instinct took over. She gathered the small body into her arms. Gabriel nestled his head on her shoulder, sighed deeply, and within seconds fell asleep. The warmth of that moment was so intense, so pure, that tears welled in Elisa's eyes. It was a private miracle, a secret shared between her and the baby. Across the room, Michael, the other twin, who had watched the scene from his crib, began to whimper, a sound of jealousy and longing. He reached his arms out toward Elisa, as if calling for her. The noise caught Adelaide's attention. She turned, and the sight hit her like a punch. The cleaner, in her simple uniform, holding one of the heirs to this vast fortune, while the other cried out for her. The expression on her face shifted from surprise to an icy fury. "Put him down, now!" she ordered, her voice a dangerous hiss. Startled, Elisa tried to gently place Gabriel back on the ground, but he clung to her, whimpering at the sudden movement. "Are you deaf? I said put him down," Adelaide repeated, advancing on her. She practically snatched the baby from Elisa's arms, causing him to wake up and start crying loudly. The commotion drew Richard from his study, just in time to see the scene. The housekeeper holding one wailing son, the other screaming in his crib, and Elisa, pale and trembling, backing away like a frightened animal. No one said a word, but the air was thick with unspoken accusations and a tension that could be cut with a knife. The silence that followed Adelaide's outburst was heavier than any scream. Richard Sterling looked from the housekeeper, her face flushed with rage, to Elisa, who seemed to have shrunk, her eyes fixed on the floor as if willing it to swallow her. In his arms, Gabriel was now crying in fright, and from the crib, Michael's cries echoed his brother's. The fragile harmony had been shattered. "Adelaide, my study. Now," he said, his voice low and controlled, a dangerous calm he used in his toughest business meetings. He took Gabriel from her and, with a weary motion, lifted Michael from the crib, holding one in each arm, a picture of paternal impotence. Without a glance at Elisa, he turned and went to his study, leaving her alone in the middle of the room. Her heart hammering against her ribs, she braced for the verdict, the firing that was sure to come. In the study, Adelaide didn't wait for him to speak. "You saw it! It's utterly absurd. A cleaning woman putting her hands on your sons. What kind of precedent does that set? She's undermining my authority, the nanny's authority. Who knows where this woman comes from, what kind of germs she might carry?" She spoke quickly, her voice laced with calculated outrage. "This isn't about hygiene, Richard. It's about boundaries. She's using the boy's vulnerability to gain your trust, to make herself indispensable. This emotional proximity to a stranger could affect their bond with you, the only parent they have." Each word was a poisoned arrow aimed directly at Richard's insecurities. He, who managed a net worth in the billions, who made decisions that affected the global economy, felt like a complete failure at home. Adelaide's words, though cruel, echoed his deepest fears. He was an absent father, and perhaps this woman was, in fact, occupying a space that didn't belong to her. Hours later, As Elisa was finishing her shift, Richard called for her. She entered the living room, her hands sweating, prepared for the worst. He was standing by the window, watching the night fall. "Elisa," he began without turning around, "I appreciate your concern for my sons, but I need you to understand that this house has rules. There are professionals hired to care for them." He finally turned, and the exhaustion on his face was so profound that for a moment she felt sorry for him. "From now on, your duties are to be strictly limited to cleaning. I want no interaction between you and the children. None. You are not to touch them. You are not to speak to them. Just do your job and keep your distance. Is that clear?" The command was delivered with a coldness that hurt more than any shouting. It was an accusation, a brand on her forehead. "You are not worthy." "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice a thread, perfectly clear. She turned and left, feeling as though the mansion door had closed, not just behind her, but on her heart as well. In the following days, the mansion plunged back into darkness. The crying returned, louder, more desperate, as if the babies were protesting the absence of the only calm they had ever known. Elisa followed the order to the letter. She moved through the house like a ghost, her old earbuds in, playing whatever music she had just to drown out the sound of anguish from upstairs. She cleaned the rooms while the nannies took the twins for walks, avoiding any possibility of an encounter. It was torture to walk past their hallway and hear the sobs. To know a simple song could bring relief and be forced to ignore it felt like tearing her own soul apart. Adelaide watched her with a triumphant smirk, pleased to have restored order. But the order was chaos, and the silence she so valued had been replaced by an unceasing lament. On Friday evening, exhausted and heartbroken, Elisa hurried to leave. The sound of crying followed her to the gate, and she ran into the street, desperate for David's embrace, never imagining that the longest night of her life was just beginning. Friday had dragged on with a particular cruelty. Every sob from the twins that Elisa heard through her earbuds was a needle in her heart. Richard Sterling's prohibition wasn't just a work order. It was an invisible wall separating her from two tiny souls she felt. In some inexplicable way, she could help. At the end of the day, she practically fled the mansion, its cold opulence contrasting painfully with the warmth she longed to find. The bus ride felt endless. Outside, the city pulsed with weekend energy, but inside, Elisa felt only a grey emptiness. Her only light was David, the image of his smile, of his small arms throwing themselves around her neck, was the fuel that kept her going. She got off at her usual stop, her heart already a little lighter with the proximity of home. But as she turned the corner and looked toward the gate of their apartment building, her stomach turned to ice. He wasn't there. David always waited for her on the front stoop, sitting on the bottom step with his drawing pad. It was their ritual. A cold panic began to creep up her spine. He must be with Mrs. Lucia, she told herself, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. She ran inside, knocking on her neighbor's door. Mrs. Lucia answered, her face creased with worry. "Elisa, thank goodness you're here. David went to wait for you at the gate almost an hour ago. He was so excited today." The old woman's words hit Elisa like a physical blow. Panic turned to terror. She ran back into the street, screaming his name, her voice choked with desperation. "David, my son, where are you?" The familiar streets became a labyrinth of menacing shadows. Every strange face was a potential threat. Every dark alley a hiding place for her worst nightmares. She asked everyone she passed, but no one had seen him. Night was falling, and with it, all of her hope. In her panic, her mind latched onto a trivial detail, an anchor in her sea of despair. The cleaning cloth, the special microfiber cloth she used to polish Mr. Sterling's desk. She remembered leaving it on the chair. The idea was absurd, illogical, but it was the only thing connecting her to her last moment of normalcy. What if David somehow had gone there? How? Why? It didn't matter. It was a one-in-a-million chance, a thread of hope she clung to with all her might. She ran back, catching the first bus, going in the opposite direction, tears streaming down her face without her even noticing. When she arrived, she found the side gate, used by staff, ajar. She slipped inside, her heart in her throat. The mansion was submerged in a deep, unnatural silence. Where was the crying? Her whole body trembling, she headed toward the study, the only light an amber glow from a lamp inside. The door was ajar. She pushed it open slowly, her heart about to burst. And then she froze. The scene before her defied all reality. There, on the immense dark leather sofa, slept the two twins, Gabriel and Michael. It wasn't a fitful sleep, punctuated by sobs. It was a deep, serene slumber, their faces as peaceful as two angels. And nestled between them, with one arm across one's chest and his head resting on the other's shoulder, was her David, sleeping the same peaceful sleep. The relief was so violent that Elisa's legs gave out. She leaned against the doorframe, her body racked with silent, emotional sobs. It was a miracle, an inexplicable, overwhelming miracle. She didn't notice the figure watching her from the shadows of the hallway, who had witnessed the entire scene. A calm voice, heavy with an astonishment he could barely conceal, broke the silence. "Elisa!" It was Richard Sterling. And in his eyes, for the first time, she didn't see a boss, but a man who was completely and utterly stunned. Time seemed to stop in that lavish study. The only sound was the soft breathing of the three children asleep on the sofa, and Elisa's choked sobs as she struggled to compose herself in front of her employer. Richard Sterling took a step into the room, his eyes fixed on the scene, as if afraid a false move might break the spell. He looked at his sons, at the relaxed features he hadn't seen in months, at the peace that emanated from them, and then at the unknown boy nestled between them, a little guardian angel who had accomplished the impossible. Finally, his gaze landed on Elisa, and a mix of confusion, shock, and reluctant admiration filled his expression. He couldn't form a question. The words about Bitcoin, investments, and stock markets that dominated his vocabulary seemed useless and hollow in the face of this simple, powerful truth. He was gone, Elisa stammered, wiping tears with the back of her hand, her voice still trembling. "I couldn't find him at the apartment. I didn't know where to look. I came back here because I forgot a cloth. I never imagined." The explanation trailed off. Unnecessary. Richard just nodded slowly. He'd come home early, drawn by the unprecedented silence. He'd found the nanny watching TV in the den and, upon going upstairs, saw the empty cribs. Panic had struck him for an instant, until he heard a soft giggle coming from his study. Peeking through the door, he had watched the scene unfold. His sons, who until then barely interacted with their toys, were mesmerized by this little boy showing them how to stack blocks. There was no crying, only curiosity. He had stood there, hidden, watching for nearly an hour, witnessing the impossible happen. He had watched David yawn and lie down, and his sons, as if following a leader, had mimicked the gesture, snuggling up to him until they all drifted off to sleep. "What's his name?" Richard asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. "David," Elisa replied. Richard approached the sofa and, with a gentleness that surprised even himself, touched Gabriel's forehead. It was cool. The persistent, low-grade fever they'd had for weeks was gone. He looked at Elisa, and the barrier between them, of wealth, of status, of power, seemed to dissolve in that moment. They were just two parents, awestruck by the unfathomable mystery of their children. "They've never slept like this," he admitted, the vulnerability plain in his voice. "Never." Just then, Adelaide swept into the study, her face a mask of indignation. "Mr. Sterling, what is this child doing here? This is a violation of every rule. I've called security." Her shrill voice shattered the sacred atmosphere. Before Richard could respond, David stirred, mumbled something about a blue dog, and opened his eyes. Seeing his mother, he smiled sleepily. "Mommy, I made friends." The simplicity of the phrase disarmed everyone but Adelaide. "This is an outrage," she continued. "This woman brought her son into your home without permission. It is an irreparable breach of trust." But Richard cut her off, raising a hand. "That's enough, Adelaide." His tone was final, leaving no room for argument. He knelt in front of David. "Hi, David. I'm Richard, Gabriel and Michael's dad. Thank you so much for playing with them." David, unintimidated, just smiled. Elisa, seeing the fury in Adelaide's eyes, knew that while the immediate crisis had passed, a silent war had just been declared. The housekeeper no longer saw her as a simple cleaner. Now, she saw her as a real and dangerous threat to her power and her place in that house. And the look on her face promised she wouldn't rest until she had eliminated her. The miracle on the leather sofa might have saved the night, but Elisa felt a chill run down her spine. She had the terrible feeling it had also started a nightmare. The miracle in Richard Sterling's study irrevocably altered the atmosphere of the mansion. The silence of that night extended through the weekend, a fragile, unprecedented peace that left everyone, especially the master of the house, in a state of awe. Richard, a man whose world was governed by logic, data, and the predictability of financial markets, found himself facing a phenomenon that defied any rational explanation. David's presence seemed to have rewired his son's energy, calming a storm that no fortune or specialist could quell. However, the baby's peace contrasted with the growing tension among the adults. Adelaide moved through the house like a thundercloud, her face grim, her usual efficiency now tinged with a palpable resentment. Her eyes followed Elisa's every move, and every order she gave was loaded with sharp, passive hostility. "Elisa, the library floor needs to be polished again. I tested it with my handkerchief, and there's still residue," she would say, knowing full well the floor was gleaming. "Elisa, the silver vases in the East Hall are tarnished. Make sure they are impeccable." They were tests. Small displays of power to reassert her dominance and wear down Elisa's patience. Behind the facade of professional demand, Adelaide began her insidious work. In casual conversations with the nannies and other staff, she planted seeds of mistrust. "It's strange, don't you think? This woman shows up and suddenly the children are calm. It must be some kind of trick." To Richard, her approach was more subtle and dangerous. "Sir, I understand your relief, but we must be cautious," she'd say, her tone one of false concern. "Children from less privileged environments can carry illnesses that don't manifest immediately. The boys' health is our greatest asset. We can't risk it." Richard found himself caught in a crossfire. On one hand, the undeniable evidence. His sons were better. They were eating well, sleeping for hours on end, and even hazarding their first smiles. On the other, the voice of reason personified by Adelaide, who for years had been the guardian of his home and privacy. Pressured, he made a decision that seemed to him a sensible compromise, but which to Elisa felt like another slap in the face. He called her to his study again. "Elisa," he began, avoiding her gaze, "given what's happened, and for the well-being of my sons, I'd like to propose a new arrangement. I want your son, David, to spend the afternoons here after school. I'll hire a car service to pick him up. He can play with Gabriel and Michael under a nanny's supervision." Elisa felt a flicker of hope, which was immediately extinguished by what came next. "However, I must reinforce what I said before. Your interaction with my sons is to remain strictly professional. You are here to work. Your son's presence is an exception, not a change in your duties. I want to avoid any emotional attachments that could complicate things in the future." The proposal was a cruel mix of generosity and distrust. He wanted the cure, David, but rejected the source. Elisa felt like a provider of an impersonal service, her humanity and maternal instincts once again set aside. But how could she refuse? The opportunity for David to spend his afternoons in a safe environment with toys and quality food was something she could never provide. Besides, the principal's threat still loomed. Having David leave school in a private car would solve the tardiness problem. With a heavy heart, she accepted. "Yes, sir. I understand." From that day on, the routine changed. David would arrive in the afternoon, and the house would fill with children's laughter. Elisa, while scrubbing floors or cleaning windows, would hear the joy on the other side of a wall and feel a mixture of happiness and pain. She was so close, yet light years away, separated by a wall of money, fear, and prejudice. And Adelaide watched it all, hatred growing in her chest, waiting patiently for the right moment to strike. The new routine settled over the Sterling mansion like the tense calm before a storm. The afternoons were filled with David's laughter and the twins' happy gurgles. For Richard, coming home to a peaceful environment was a balm, a novelty so welcome that he chose to ignore the undercurrent of conflict flowing beneath the surface. He saw the positive effect on his sons and clung to it, avoiding any questions about the complexity of the situation. David's presence was the solution he had been seeking, and the arrangement forced upon Elisa seemed, in his eyes, a necessary measure of control to maintain professional order in his house. He focused on his business, on growing his capital and managing his investments in cryptocurrency and international funds, delegating the emotional management of his home to rules and boundaries, just as he did with his companies. For Elisa, each day was an exercise in self-control. It was a sweet and bitter torture to hear her son's happiness through a closed door. Sometimes she would see him through the garden window, running on the grass with the twins crawling awkwardly behind him, and her heart would fill with a love that overflowed in silent tears. She followed Richard's orders to the letter, maintaining a physical and emotional distance from the babies. Even when her instincts screamed for her to draw near, this obedience, however, did not appease Adelaide's fury. On the contrary, the housekeeper saw Elisa's growing influence, however indirect, as a cancer spreading through the house. The gratitude Richard showed David, and by extension Elisa, was a direct threat to her position of power, built over years of loyal service and discreet manipulation. She decided it was time to act decisively. Adelaide's plan was cruel in its simplicity. She knew Richard's weaknesses, his fear of failing as a father, and his dread of scandals that could tarnish his family name and affect his business. She began to build her narrative. First, during a conversation with Richard, she mentioned offhandedly that she had overheard Elisa on the phone. It sounded like a tense conversation about debts, overdue rent. "I got the sense she was very desperate," she commented, planting the seed of financial need. A few days later, she accidentally left her own bank statement on the kitchen counter, a document displaying the generous bonus she had received, a subtle reminder of the value money held in that house. The final blow was planned with surgical precision. Adelaide owned a valuable pearl necklace with a gold clasp, a family heirloom she treasured. It was a piece Richard knew well, as she wore it to every important family event. That morning, Adelaide slipped into Elisa's staff room while she was cleaning the master bathroom. Her heart pounding, she opened Elisa's worn bag, which hung on a hook behind the door. With slightly trembling hands, she dropped the pearl necklace into an inner pocket, pushing it to the bottom beneath a tissue. Later that day, the housekeeper feigned panic. She ran to Richard's study, her face pale and her breathing ragged. "Mr. Sterling, my necklace! My pearl necklace is gone. It was in my jewelry box this morning, and now it's vanished. It's the only valuable thing my mother left me." Richard tried to calm her, suggesting she might have put it somewhere else. "No," Adelaide insisted, tears beginning to stream down her face. "I know where I keep it. The only person who went into my rooms today to clean was Elisa." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. "Sir, I don't want to believe it, but she's been so desperate for money. Please just check her bag. If I'm wrong, I will beg for forgiveness on my knees. But if I'm right..." Richard felt a chill. The suggestion was terrible, but the seed of doubt Adelaide had planted days before had found fertile ground. Reluctantly, he agreed. The walk from the study to the small staff changing room felt like the longest of Richard's life. Each step echoed on the polished marble, a hollow sound that mirrored the emptiness in his chest. He didn't want to believe it. The image of Elisa, with her gentle eyes and quiet dignity, didn't fit the profile of a thief. Yet Adelaide's words, from the housekeeper he had trusted for nearly a decade, weighed on his mind. Business logic took over. There was an accusation, an unknown variable, and a need for verification. He summoned Elisa with a cold formality that made her stomach clench. He asked her to bring her belongings. Adelaide followed them, her face a mask of pain and concern, a performance worthy of a great actress. In Richard's imposing presence and under Adelaide's accusing gaze, Elisa felt the floor give way beneath her. Elisa, Adelaide has informed me that a piece of jewelry of great sentimental value has gone missing from her rooms, Richard began, his voice devoid of any emotion. She believes you may have, accidentally, placed it in your bag with your cleaning supplies. Would you please empty it? It wasn't a request. It was a command. Humiliation was a hot wave rising up her face. With trembling hands, she opened her old bag and began to pull out her few possessions. Her wallet with a few dollars, a cheap lipstick, her apartment keys, a crumpled drawing David had made for her. And then, her fingers brushed against something cold and beaded. She pulled it out. The pearl necklace gleamed under the chandelier's light, a whip of ivory and gold that seemed to crackle in the air. The silence that followed was deafening. Elisa looked from the necklace to Richard's face, then to Adelaide, who let out a choked sob, covering her mouth with her hand. The frame was perfect. I never... Elisa stammered, the words refusing to form a coherent defense. How could she explain the inexplicable? How could she fight against such concrete evidence? Richard's expression transformed. Doubt gave way to a cold, hard disappointment. The compassion he had once felt for her evaporated, replaced by the betrayal of a rich man accustomed to having his trust exploited. "I don't want to hear it," he said, his voice cutting. "Get your things. I want you out of my house in 5 minutes. You're fired." The sentence was delivered in front of Adelaide, 2 nannies passing in the hall and the driver waiting in the foyer. "But what about David?" Elisa asked, her panic for her son's safety overriding her own humiliation. "The driver will take him to your home, and he is not to set foot on this property again," Richard decreed. The cruelty of the decision hit her with full force. He wasn't just punishing her, he was punishing her son. He was tearing the joy from 3 children because of a lie. Humiliated, crushed by the weight of injustice, Elisa gathered her belongings, not daring to look at anyone. With her son sobbing in the back of the luxury car, a vehicle representing a world they would never belong to, she left the mansion for the last time, the image of Adelaide's triumphant smile seared into her memory. In the days that followed, darkness fell over the Sterling mansion with a vengeful force. The twins, deprived of their little friend, went into crisis. The crying started again, but this time it was different. It wasn't a cry of discomfort, it was a shriek of loss, a sharp, incessant sound that no nanny, no toy, no song could soothe. They stopped eating, refusing their bottles and any food. The fever returned, higher and more stubborn. Desperate, Richard took them to the hospital, where they were admitted with dehydration and acute stress. Richard's empire seemed solid, his assets secure, and his fortune unshakable. But within the walls of a hospital room, he was just a father, helpless and terrified, watching his greatest treasure slip through his fingers. The hospital room was white, sterile, and impersonal, a stark contrast to the mansion's opulence, but the atmosphere of despair was the same. The rhythmic beeps of monitors were the new soundtrack to Richard Sterling's life, replacing the incessant crying that was now muted by the twins' exhaustion. They lay in their small hospital cribs, their thin arms pricked with IV lines that dripped fluids and nutrients into their listless bodies. They barely moved, their large, sunken eyes staring at the ceiling, lost in a sadness no doctor could diagnose. Richard spent his days and nights there, his phone switched off, ignoring urgent calls from his business managers about stock market fluctuations and fund performance. For the first time in his life, the vast web of his net worth, his assets, and his investments in euros and dollars seemed completely irrelevant. What was the point of owning the world if he was losing his sons? The doctors were stumped. Blood tests, CT scans, neurological evaluations, everything came back normal. Physically, they're just dehydrated and underweight, the chief pediatrician explained. But there's an emotional component here we can't treat with medication. It's as if they've given up. The words "given up" hit Richard like a punch. He felt like the worst father in the world, a monumental failure whose billion-dollar net worth couldn't buy the health of his own children. One night, an older nurse with kind eyes and hands calloused from decades of experience came into the room to check the baby's vitals. She watched Richard, slumped in the armchair, his face buried in his hands. "They're missing someone," she said, her voice soft but firm. It wasn't a question. Richard lifted his head, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I've been in pediatrics for 30 years, she continued, adjusting the drip on Gabriel's IV. "I've seen this before. Babies form powerful bonds, as deep as any adults, maybe deeper. Sometimes, when they're abruptly separated from the person who is the center of their world, a mother, a father, a grandmother, a caregiver, they grieve. The body reacts. They stop eating. They get sick. It's a physical grief." The nurse's words were like a key, turning a rusted lock in Richard's mind. He thought of the calm that settled with Elisa's mere presence, the soft melody she would hum, the way Gabriel fell asleep in her arms, David's infectious joy. He mentioned the cleaner, the whole story tumbling out in a confused rush of guilt and regret. The nurse listened patiently. "Son," she said, with a maternal authority, "children don't care about bank accounts or social status. They care about love, safety, and scent, the smell of the person who calms them. It sounds to me, sir, like you fired your son's only medicine." The sentence struck him with the force of a revelation. A mistake. He had made a terrible mistake, based on pride, prejudice, and Adelaide's manipulation. The image of the pearl necklace flashed in his mind, but now, under this cold, hard light of truth, something felt wrong. Adelaide's performance, her calculated tears, it all seemed false. As soon as dawn broke, he made a single call, not to his lawyers or accountants, but to the head of his security team. "I want the security footage from every camera in my house from the last week. Full focus on Adelaide's and Elisa's movements. I want a detailed report of every entrance and exit, every interaction, and I want it yesterday." While he waited, he paced the hospital corridor, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. Fear of confirming his own stupidity and hope of finding a path to redemption. He wasn't just looking for Elisa's innocence, he was looking for his son's salvation. The email with the video files arrived hours later. Sitting in the desolate hospital cafeteria, Richard opened his laptop with the urgency of a man whose life depended on those images. The truth unspooled before his eyes, frame by frame, in brutal, undeniable clarity. He saw Adelaide slipping into Elisa's staff room, the furtiveness in her movements, the quick glance down the hall before she disappeared inside. Minutes later, the camera in the main foyer caught her rehearsing her look of panic, adjusting her expression in the reflection of a mirror before she ran to his study. The footage was a silent confession, irrefutable proof of the cruelty and manipulation he had allowed to happen under his roof. Shame consumed him, a hot, suffocating wave. He hadn't just been fooled, he had been a willing accomplice, blinded by his own biases, and the ease of believing a lie that aligned with his insecurities. Without hesitating, he called Adelaide. The conversation was short and icy. "I've seen the footage, Adelaide. Pack your things. A car will take you wherever you want to go. Your severance will be deposited. Don't ever contact me again." On the other end of the line, there was only a stunned silence, followed by the click of the phone being hung up. Firing the housekeeper was the easy part. The task that came next was the hardest he had ever faced. He had to ask for forgiveness. Finding Elisa wasn't simple. The address he had was for the apartment building, but when he got there, he learned she had moved out days before. Too ashamed to face her neighbors, Mrs. Lucia, the kind-hearted old woman, was the one who gave him the new location, an even smaller room at the back of a laundromat in a distant neighborhood. Richard knocked on the flimsy door, feeling like a giant in a world that was not his own. When Elisa opened it, her face shifted from surprise to a hard, cold mistrust. The suffering of the past weeks had made her thinner, and there was a shadow in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice flat, blocking the doorway with her body. "Elisa, he began, but the words felt inadequate. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. I know everything. I saw the footage. Adelaide set you up. I am so sorry." The confession, which he thought might break the ice, barely seemed to register on her face. "Sorry doesn't pay the rent, Mr. Sterling," she replied, the bitterness sharp. "It doesn't erase the humiliation. It doesn't explain to my son why he can't see his friends anymore." It was the mention of David that broke him. "My sons, they're in the hospital," he said, his voice cracking. "They won't eat. They're giving up. They need you. They need David. I'm not here to ask you to come back to work for me like before. I'm here to beg." He then did something he hadn't done in years. He relinquished control. "I want to fix this, but not on my terms, on yours." Elisa stared at him for a long moment, the conflict visible on her face. Her motherly love for the twins battled with the pain of betrayal. Finally, she stepped back. "Come in," she said. In that small room, smelling of laundry detergent and dignity, they talked for hours. Elisa, for the first time, spoke not as an employee, but as an equal. She laid out her conditions, a formal employment contract with full rights and a fair salary, not to clean, but to care for the children. A schedule that would allow her to be a mother to David, not just a worker, and most importantly, respect. A promise that she would never again be judged for her background or financial status. "I don't want your pity or your charity. I want what's fair," she concluded. Richard Sterling, the billionaire who dealt in inheritances and fortunes, simply nodded. "Fair," he repeated. "You'll have everything that's fair." It was the beginning of a new contract, one based not on money, but on mutual trust and the desperate need for healing. The return of Elisa and David to the mansion wasn't a return, but a new beginning. The first place they went was not the kitchen or the service area, but the hospital. When Elisa walked into the sterile white room, the twins, who had been listless in their cribs, turned their heads toward her. A flicker of recognition lit their sunken eyes. She approached, saying nothing, and began to hum the old lullaby. Michael reached a frail little arm toward her. She lifted him into her arms, and he nestled into her chest, sighing deeply, like a traveler finally come home. David, holding Richard's hand, walked up to Gabriel's crib and showed him a small stuffed toy. A weak smile, the first in many days, graced the baby's lips. That afternoon, for the first time in a week, the twins took their bottles, their eyes fixed on Elisa as if afraid she would disappear again. 6 months later, the Sterling mansion was unrecognizable, not in its structure, for the wealth and material assets remained the same, but in its soul. The oppressive silence had been replaced by the constant sound of children's laughter echoing through the marble halls. Meals were no longer solitary events. The enormous dining table now accommodated Richard, Elisa, and the 3 children in their high chairs. a happy mess of spilled food and lively chatter. Elisa was no longer the cleaner, nor just the caregiver. She had become the heart of the home, a calm, steady presence who taught everyone the true meaning of family. Her contract, drafted by Richard, was more than fair. It recognized her value not just with a generous salary, but with shares in an educational trust fund created for the future of all three children, ensuring that the family's assets would also serve to build David's future. Richard had changed profoundly. The workaholic who saw the world through spreadsheets of profits and dividends had learned to find returns in the small moments, teaching David to ride a bike in the immense garden, reading a story to the twins before bed, or simply sitting in silence in the kitchen while Elisa cooked dinner, feeling a peace no financial investment had ever provided. He began to delegate more in his business, discovering that the true cash flow of his life was love. The friendship and respect between him and Elisa blossomed on a foundation of mutual trust, slowly turning into a deeper feeling, a quiet, genuine affection built on the ashes of a terrible misunderstanding. They were partners, creating a new definition of family together, one bound not by blood, but by choice and healing. One sunny afternoon, as they watched the three children playing together on the lawn, Elisa picked up her old notebook, the same one where she had jotted down the first miracle on that cold night. On the last page, she wrote, "Life breaks us in mysterious ways, not to destroy us, but to break us open so that the light can get in." Richard, reading over her shoulder, smiled. He understood that the greatest fortune he had ever amassed wasn't stored in banks or Bitcoin wallets, but right there, in that garden, in the laughter of three children and the serene gaze of the woman who, possessing nothing, had given him everything. The humble cleaner who had walked into that mansion seeking a job had saved not just two children, but the soul of a man and the future of a home. And in that house, once a castle of sorrow, love had become the greatest and most irreplaceable asset of all.